there is a peculiar ache that comes not from the absence of love, but from its distortion. Most of us prepare ourselves for the sharp arrows from strangers, the inevitable bruises from the world's march of pride and profit. But few are ever ready for the coldness that may, on occasion, dwell in one's own hearth, within the walls of home, in the faces of those who bear your name, your resemblance, your history. Now, I do not speak tonight to encourage suspicion, nor to stir rebellion in hearts already weary. Instead, I invite you to consider a mystery, that sometimes when God seems silent in your relationships, He is in fact speaking most loudly through His silence, that when He removes your peace with someone you've known since childhood, it may not be punishment, but protection. It is a sacred and sometimes lonely revelation, that God will shield your soul not only from wolves in the wild, but from those in your bloodline who clothe their claws in tradition, guilt, or duty. Not every bond is blessed merely because it is biological. We have a Father in heaven who is not sentimental about bondage, but fiercely committed to liberty. And when someone, even a relative, becomes a vessel not of light, but of heaviness, of diminishment rather than edification, the Father moves, quietly, patiently, decisively. What does that look like? How does one discern divine protection in the slow unraveling of a relationship you thought was permanent? First, you may find that your spirit grows increasingly restless in their presence, not in a natural, momentary way, but in a way that stifles your joy and dims your hope. Conversations that once gave you life now leave you drained, confused, or quietly condemned. There is a sense that something invisible in you shrinks when they enter the room. This is not paranoia, it may well be discernment. The Holy Spirit whispers in discomfort before He shouts in crisis. The soul, being aligned with heaven, recognizes when a familiar voice no longer echoes truth, but dissonance. Second, doors begin to close mysteriously. Plans with this person fail. Communication falters. You attempt to pursue reconciliation or deeper connection, and yet things misfire. Calls unanswered, messages misread, efforts misunderstood. And you wonder, why does it seem like everything between us is becoming fragile? Could it be that the hand of God is gently, graciously allowing this distance to grow, not to punish but to protect? We often assume divine protection comes only in the form of flaming swords and parted seas, but sometimes it comes through unanswered text messages. Third, your prayers become sharper and more honest. You find yourself asking God questions you never dared utter aloud. Why do I always feel small around them? Why does their opinion still haunt me after all these years? Why do I feel guilty for growing? That, my friend, is the Spirit of God awakening you. He does not merely change your circumstances, He matures your questions. He teaches you to interrogate not the other person's actions, but your own patterns of tolerance. And when you begin to see that what you called loyalty was in truth captivity, you are already halfway free. Fourth, your progress begins to accelerate the moment you place boundaries around the relationship. Some will say it is selfish to step away, but is it selfish to guard a garden that you've wept over, sowed into, prayed for? Is it selfish to say, no more access to the part of me you consistently harm? If your progress in life gains clarity, strength, and momentum when their influence fades, it is a quiet sign. The vine of your soul was choking under the weight of a presence not assigned to your next chapter. There are family members who cannot celebrate your freedom because it condemns their bondage. You, growing, becoming, healing, becomes a mirror to their stagnation. So they dress their criticism in concern, their jealousy in tradition, their resentment in religious phrases, but their fruit reveals the root. And God, who sees behind every mask and hears the motives beneath every word, begins to gently separate you from those whose words always seem to clip your wings. Fifth, You start to taste joy without them. And that joy is not bitter, it's not vengeful, it's quiet, subtle, gentle, like a morning breeze, like the first clean breath after a storm has passed. And you realize that God did not remove them to punish you or to isolate you, but to give you space to see clearly your worth, your purpose, your path. You realize that they were not the source of your peace, only the occupiers of your attention, and without their draining presence, you begin to hear again the music of grace, the whisper of purpose, the voice of the Father calling you by name, not by your wounds. Lastly, and perhaps this is the greatest sign, you begin to love them differently, not from enmeshment, not from obligation, but from freedom, from a distance if necessary. You stop trying to fix them. You stop performing for their approval. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And you begin to bless them in prayer, in thought, in hope, but no longer at the cost of your sanity or calling. You see, God does not always protect you from pain, but He always protects you from destruction. And when someone, even someone related to you, begins to consistently tear down what God is building up in you, the Lord will not be silent. He will act, often in ways that seem mundane, until you look back and see His fingerprints on every pause, every delay, every moment of disconnection. There is a strange mercy in being hidden, from people, from praise, and yes, even from family. God hides you when He's healing you. He separates you when He's sanctifying you. And sometimes, in order to protect your destiny, He will break the idols of familiarity that we have set too close to our hearts. Not every family member is an enemy, but not every family member is a friend either. The ones God shields you from are not always wicked. They are sometimes simply wounded. But if their wounds have become weapons turned toward your soul, God, in His mercy, intervenes. And so I say to you, if you felt the quiet pulling away, the invisible hand of heaven urging you to redefine the relationship, pay attention. If your peace grows when your distance increases, pay attention. If your prayers are clearer when they are not in the picture, pay attention. God is a God of order, and when something, even someone, brings persistent confusion, discouragement, or spiritual weariness into your life, He may remove them not because you are not strong enough to endure, but because He is strong enough to rescue. Let us not weep endlessly for those God has repositioned. Let us not cling to relationships whose expiration dates have long passed. Instead, let us trust that He who began a good work in us will not allow it to be sabotaged, not even by the hands of kin. And let us remember this, God is not sentimental. He is sovereign, and He loves you too much to let the wrong person stay too close for too long. Perhaps, just perhaps, His protection is not a wall, but a whisper, not a sword, but a silence, not a punishment, but a pause. And in that holy pause, you are being saved. There is something deeply humbling about realizing that the most significant shifts in your life often occur without dramatic announcements. No thunder, no lightning, just a subtle unraveling. An ache that lingers after each interaction, a hesitation before you answer the phone, a pause before you speak. And slowly you begin to see the divine choreography at work, a heavenly strategy to preserve the integrity of your calling, not out of cruelty, but out of a wisdom that sees further than we do. God sees the impact a word can have on your spirit, the weight of a sigh, the silent sting behind a glance, and He moves to preserve what you're becoming, not just what you've survived. It may feel like betrayal to admit that someone you once loved deeply, perhaps still do, is no longer safe for your heart. But let us not confuse compassion with compromise. You are not disloyal for protecting your spirit. You are not dishonoring your family by honoring your assignment. For there comes a time when obedience to God may look like resistance to tradition, and healing may look like separation. And that separation, though painful, is often the very soil in which your purpose begins to bloom without interference. There is also a sacred lesson in silence, when God prevents you from saying what you want to say, when He restrains your tongue and softens your reactions. It may not be weakness, it may be strategy. He knows that certain arguments will only entangle you further, that certain conversations are not paths to peace, but pits that swallow your progress, and so He gives you silence as a sword. Not to harm, but to defend, not to retreat, but to win quietly. You may also find yourself surrounded by unexpected voices during these seasons. New people who speak life where others once spoke doubt. New mentors, new friends, even divine appointments in places you didn't expect. And this is not accidental. When God removes one influence, He is faithful to replace it with another, one that aligns with your future, not your fears. But to receive the new, you must unclench your grip on the old. There is no room for resurrection where there is no death, and God, being both gardener and guardian, knows when to prune the familiar to make room for the fruitful. Consider also the way your dreams return. The ideas you once buried under the weight of criticism or manipulation begin to resurface. You begin to imagine again, to envision freely. You catch yourself smiling without explanation, laughing again, worshipping with clarity, even weeping, not out of grief, but gratitude, not because all is well, but because something inside you finally is, and the absence of a voice that once dominated your mind creates a sacred stillness, an open space in which God Himself can speak again. It is a holy thing when the Lord reclaims your inner world from a voice that was never meant to control it. Some family members do not enslave with chains, but with expectations, with obligations that wear the disguise of affection, with subtle criticisms that shape your identity by default. And slowly, their voice becomes your inner critic. Their doubts become your ceiling. But when God intervenes, He begins to dismantle the tower they built inside your mind, brick by brick, thought by thought, until you wake one day and realize you no longer fear their disapproval. You no longer crave their validation. You are free. Freedom, however, often feels like loss at first. It is not adorned in trumpets and banners. It shows up quietly, wrapped in lonely evenings and second-guessing. And yet, it is in those very moments of aloneness that you begin to hear the voice that has always been calling, the voice that says, "You are mine, you are enough, you are becoming." That voice does not shame you for stepping back. It invites you to step forward, forward into your identity, forward into peace, forward into the kind of love that does not require you to shrink in order to be accepted. Some will accuse you of arrogance for walking away. Others will say you are cold. But you are not cold. You are no longer numbing yourself to survive proximity. You are not arrogant. You are finally sober enough to stop calling dysfunction your duty. And while the world may not understand, heaven rejoices when one of God's children chooses life over familiarity, truth over comfort, and alignment over. And even as you walk this narrow road, you may feel torn. You may feel guilty for wanting joy when others are content with survival. But that guilt is not yours to carry. God is not glorified when you dim your light for those who refuse to open their eyes. You are not selfish for refusing to be emotionally manipulated. You are not cruel for putting boundaries around chaos. You are wise. You are becoming what He intended, someone who walks in truth even when it costs connection, someone who loves but no longer at the expense of their peace. It is one of the great paradoxes of the spiritual life that God will sometimes protect you by removing what you thought you couldn't live without, And he will often allow heartbreak, not because he's cruel, but because he knows what comes next. And in that process, you begin to trust not only his heart, but his hand. You begin to see that the very separation you resented was actually a rescue, that what you thought was rejection was in fact redirect. And what felt like abandonment was actually the beginning of adoption into something higher, deeper, eternal. When you begin to thrive without the voices that once drained you, you become a threat to the cycles that once confined you, and those cycles, spiritual, emotional, even generational, begin to break, not loudly, not instantly, but decisively, like a glass cracking from pressure, until at last it shatters and suddenly you see what you were too close to see before, that the person God protected you from was not only draining you, but delaying you. Delay is one of the enemy's most subtle weapons, especially through people who carry your history, your name, your blood. The enemy will whisper, honor them, even as they dishonor you. Be patient, even as they manipulate. And yet the Spirit of God speaks differently. Be wise, be free, be holy. Holiness is not simply avoiding sin, it is choosing alignment. It is walking away from anything that keeps you from becoming the fullest version of yourself in Christ, even if that anything has your last name. And so you find yourself walking not in rebellion, but in obedience, not in bitterness, but in clarity. You no longer need to win their affection. You no longer need to convince them of your worth. You have made peace with not being understood, because you have been understood by God. And when his understanding anchors you, no other approval can enslave you. You begin to see how much of your life was shaped not by truth, but by the pressure to conform, how often you diluted your light just to keep the peace at a table where you were only ever half welcome. You remember all the moments you laughed when your heart was breaking, agreed when your soul was screaming, complied when everything in you wanted to resist. And now, with spiritual eyes awakened, you trace the thread of divine intervention woven quietly through every painful withdrawal. The arguments you didn't have, the apologies you stopped begging for, the endless cycles you once accepted as normal, but now recognize as bondage. This awakening isn't arrogant, it's holy. It's the deep and trembling knowledge that you were never meant to spend your life placating brokenness, that it's not rebellion to refuse dysfunction disguised as family loyalty, that some people weren't placed in your life to be healed by you. They were placed there so you'd learn to let God be God. And when he steps in to separate, to shield, to protect, you obey not because it makes sense to the world, but because you've come to trust that his protection often comes before his explanation. And still there is compassion in your heart. You do not hate them, you do not seek vengeance, but you are no longer willing to confuse closeness with health. Some people are tied to your past, but cannot follow you into your future. And while that may ache in your humanity, it makes perfect sense in the spirit. The road to purpose has always been narrow, not because God is cruel, but because destiny cannot afford the weight of every relationship we wish we could preserve. What surprises you most is the grief, not always over what happened, but over the illusion you carried. The illusion that they would always be your anchor. The belief that if you just tried harder, explained better, loved deeper, they would see you. But they never did. And not because you weren't worth seeing, but because they chose not to see. There is nothing more painful than being invisible in a relationship where you're expected to pour yourself out. Nothing lonelier than sacrificing your voice just to maintain peace with someone who uses your silence as a seat of control. But when God begins to reclaim your voice, you speak differently, not louder, just clearer. You no longer ask for permission to be whole. You no longer justify your distance with long explanations. You simply say, "This is what peace looks like for me." And that peace, becomes a boundary in itself. A line that says, "Here is where I end and you begin. I can love you, but I cannot carry you. I can pray for you, but I cannot fix you. I can honor your story, but I will not make myself small to fit inside it." This is where many misunderstand you. They think you've grown cold, detached, hardened. But what they're witnessing isn't hardness, it's healing. It's the resolve of someone who has come through fire and now refuses to live in smoke. It's the quiet power of someone who has seen what constant exposure to criticism can do to the human soul and who has chosen life instead. What's more, you begin to realize just how generational this battle has been. You start to connect the dots between your experience and your ancestors' silence. You see how many in your family have confused suffering with holiness, chaos with closeness, martyrdom with maturity. And then it becomes clear, God isn't just protecting you for your sake. He's doing something generational. He's breaking a pattern so deeply entrenched in your bloodline that you didn't even realize it was a pattern. You thought it was personality, culture, just the way things are, but it wasn't. It was a spiritual entanglement, and now it's unraveling. And while the unraveling may be lonely, it is also deeply sacred, because as things come apart, something new begins to form. You start to sense the Father's pleasure, not because you did everything right, but because you finally stopped sacrificing yourself on the altar of someone else's comfort. You begin to sense His nearness in your rest, His approval in your boundaries, His joy in your freedom. And that perhaps is the most telling sign of all, that what once brought you turmoil no longer has access to your peace. And you carry that peace like a compass. It guides your decisions, it governs your reactions, it shapes your relationships. You don't go back to old cycles, not because you're bitter, but because you're free. And freedom has its own rhythm, its own wisdom, its own strength. You begin to live in such a way that your very presence becomes a boundary, your very choices a declaration. I will not return to the place where my soul was silent. And so, let it be known, not in rage, not in rebellion, but in reverent truth, that God's protection is not always wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it comes in the form of distance, in closed doors, in silent departures, in the sudden stillness after years of noise. And though your heart may wrestle with the ache of letting go, your spirit knows this was God. He does not remove without reason. He does not isolate without intention. When He shields you from a family member who brings you down, He is not dividing your household. He is preserving your destiny. He is not dishonoring your roots. He is revealing your wings. Because you were never meant to live your life shackled by guilt, controlled by fear, or diminished by those too broken to see your light. So walk forward, not with bitterness, but with boldness, not carrying shame, but carrying truth. Let love remain in your heart, but let wisdom guide your steps. For the same God who knit you in your mother's womb has now drawn a line in the spirit. No more cycles, no more compromise, no more chains. You were not just called to survive your bloodline, you were called to redeem it. And that redemption begins with the courage to say, enough. Let the past stay where it belongs. Let the healing run deep, and let your peace speak for itself. Because when God protects you, even from those closest to you, it's never to punish. It's always to propel.